Welcome to Two Taps and Friends. Grab your favorite drink, get comfy, and let's dive into another episode of Two Taps and Friends.
Welcome back to Two Taps and Friends. It's your host, Danny Rosenberg. I'm here, and I have my colleague, Lloyd Golburgh, back on to continue our discussion on the Israel-Palestinian conflict that obviously is still raging on. Welcome back, Lloyd, first of all.
Thank you.
Thank you for always coming. It's always a pleasure to have you on. I wanted to start because there's obviously some developments that have happened that are extremely troubling. We talked about, we've all seen the protests for almost a year and a half now, and these vile statements that are being posted on everywhere, and these I call them rats online that are just literally throwing anti-Semitism out there. And, it's culminated to a young couple leaving the Israeli embassy. One of them's Christian, but I guess he is an embassy, works at the embassy. That's the dialogue they're trying to say. They're embassy workers. One girl, they're both in their 20s. They're getting engaged. And a lunatic Latin guy who's like a pro-Palestine kid just walks up and executes them. Literally shoots her, I think, like 22 times as she's begging for her life, crawling away, kills them both, and yells "Free Palestine" as soon as it's done for all the cameras to see. Now, you would think that the response, would be outrage, right? And how did we get here? And there's literally people, all these rats online are justifying it, saying, this is what happens. And again, switching the narrative to, Israel. And this is stuff that we've been warning about. We've been talking about. Jews have been talking about it. Pro-Israel, pro-U.S. people have been talking about this. These idiots on college campuses, or idiots, in the best light, right? And the worst light, just pure anti-Semites, are calling. They've been calling for Intifada. They've been calling, from the river to the sea. Where the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free of Jews. That's what they want. That's what they've been saying. And Intifada, they don't even know what Intifada is. They think it's Uprising, as if it's like the Star Wars series, like it's Luke Skywalker. The Intifada. Why don't you explain to the viewers the Intifada and some of the history of the Intifada?
Yeah, the Intifadas are uprisings, as your wife told us off camera.
Violent uprising.
Intifada is an Arabic word that means to shake off. And I think that, to your point, I think probably a lot of the kids, especially on college campuses, are manipulated to believe that it's a nonviolent uprising. But it certainly is a violent uprising. And there's been multiple intifadas where the Palestinian population rises up and instigates violence against the Jewish population. And one of the main precursors, one of the causes of that is that the Arab leadership will start spreading rumors that the Jews are somehow going to desecrate the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which sits adjacent to the Temple Mount. And of course, that is a very, very, very sacred entity in Islam. So when you tell your population that the Israelis are going to desecrate either the mosque or the Temple Mount or both,
which they've never done in history.
Well, on the contrary, as part of the establishment of the State of Israel was to make sure that the holy sites, particularly the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, are protected and that are accessible to everybody, except Jews. Of course, Jews can go and pray at the Western Wall, but they're not allowed on the Temple Mount.
Right. But specifically Intifada, though, the first Intifada was around the 2000s, and you were saying Ariel Sharon did a tour on the Al-Aqsa Mosque where he walked around.
Right.
And to understand, to give you context, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the Muslim quarter, the Muslim side of Jerusalem. The other side is controlled by Israel, is considered the Judeo-Israeli side, where the Jews and Christians can go around there, and the Muslims are allowed to go on the Judeo-Christian side. But on the Muslim side, no one's allowed to go in.
Right.
In the Al-Aqsa Mosque ever, all right? So it was a statement by Ariel Sharon, who some people think he was a little bit more hardline, went in there, he caught a lot of criticism from the Israelis for doing it as well, but he walked there and it started a string of suicide bomb attacks, bus bombings, pizza parlor bombings where kids were getting killed, families were getting killed. Literally blew up a discotheque with 15-year-olds, like a teen club, just mauled all these people. And it was...
There were thousands of casualties.
Thousands of casualties, which is a very traumatic period for the Israelis as a whole. There was a second Intifada. What was that? It was the late 2000s or mid-2000s.
Right.
Again, another Intifada, another string of suicide bombs, bomb attacks, explosions. This is what Intifada is. If you're not from this region and you don't have no idea, you're looking at Intifada as if it's some kind of uprising, like I said, like a Star Wars movie. It's not. This is violence, killing civilians, killing children. That's what the Jews that understand what this is have been hearing on their college campuses when they're walking, when we turn on the TV, on YouTube, on comments. That's what we're hearing. That's what you've been calling for. And it should be no surprise that this is where we came to. You're calling for global Intifada. You're calling for global violence against Jews. And we saw it.
Right. We saw it. And it culminated in, what happened last week when, those two young people were shot outside of that event on the streets of Washington, D.C. It's ironic. I think, I don't remember if it was the Emir of Dubai or of the Emirates. I think it might have been the Emirates that came out and said it's safer for a Jew to walk the streets here in the Emirates than it would be for a Jew to walk the streets in Washington, D.C.
Right. Well, they become more sane. The Emirates, the UAE, they don't want this Islamic fundamentalism in their country. They've done a lot to kick it out of their country.
Yes, they have banned the Muslim Brothers.
Surprisingly, the Saudis, right? You'd be surprised because you think all the hijackers were Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
That was the Wahhabi strain of Islamism that was in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia did a lot to push those people out.
Yeah.
And that's why UAE is a part of the Abraham Accord, and Saudi Arabia is coming to the table and about to sign the Abraham Accords with Israel too because they're fed up with it, right? They're fed up with this. They know what Intifada means.
Right.
They know, and they're sitting there, and you hear the UAE guys like, this is unbelievable. These kids are chanting for things that...
They haven't, right. Even the Muslim Arabs in the United Arab Emirates and Dubai are saying, what are these college kids? Do they have any idea what they're talking about?
How are you not arresting these kids? They're saying, right? And freedom of speech, freedom of speech. But again, let's talk about the freedom of speech, right? Why don't we talk about that for a minute, Lloyd? Because you and I are lawyers.
Yeah.
We know what the freedom of speech is, and we know what what is protected speech and what is not protected speech, Lloyd? Let's give the basic definition here.
Should we use the New York Times definition? I know it of pornography. You know it when you see it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have the freedom to express ideas, right? And without being prosecuted by the government for doing so. Okay, and that encompasses a lot of things. Actions can be encompassed within freedom of speech for sure. However, not all speech is free. In other words, you don't have 100% free speech and can say whatever you want.
Incitement to violence
is not freedom of speech.
Right. Okay. Kill the Jews.
Not freedom of speech.
Global Intifada.
Not freedom of speech.
Right.
Because you are inciting violence, especially in an environment.
Towards a specific group, too.
Correct. And an environment where violence is likely to occur as the result of your incitement. It's not free speech. So I'll give you these. Let's talk about what's
contrast real quick. You can say, I hate Jews.
Yes, you can.
Protected speech.
Yes, it is.
You could say Hitler was right, which is ridiculous, but protected speech. I don't have to like you, but you're allowed to say it, and I will fight for your right to say it.
Yes.
Right? The famous quote.
Yes.
But when you say, let's kill the Jews.
Right.
Or we need to kill the Jews or globalize Intifada, we need to drive these people, that's not protected.
Right. And it is a fine line. I get it. I do. And free speech is the cornerstone of our society, right? But there's you can make the argument, and I would, that there's a difference between saying, I wish all the Jews were dead. Free speech to me. But it's another to say, go kill the Jews.
Right.
And globalize the Intifada, because what you're saying when you say globalize the Intifada is kill Jews everywhere you find them.
Right.
Okay, that's what you're saying. That's an incitement to violence. That's not legal. But that's not necessarily only what's going on college campuses. The kids aren't standing on a quad just yelling. They're acting as well. They're harassing. They're physically assaulting. They're
going in,
preventing kids from getting into their classes. They're
guise of Zionists. I love that. They cloak it under, we are not letting Zionists cross through.
Right. Right. Again, back to the collective punishment idea. You're punishing Jewish kids in New York City for the actions of the Israeli government. It doesn't.
How do you screen for Zionists on a college campus? How do you do that screening? Explain that to me. Like, oh well, you look Jewish. You're probably a Zionist.
Maybe the way the Muslims did it in Kashmir a couple of months ago, where they tried to identify who was Muslim and who wasn't by making all of the males drop their pants before slaughtering those that turned out to be Muslim.
Right.
Because we know that they circumcise as well. Just another cultural appropriation.
Right. I mean, it's very clear, what you're differentiating and what you're trying to do, and that's not protected speech.
No.
And we've been warning, and people have been saying, this is what's going to happen. This is what it is. It comes in the form of shooting random people in the street. It comes in the form of taking a car and running over people, like in New Orleans with the guy with the guy had an Al-Qaeda flag on his truck. We're not talking about that. Why are we not talking about that, by the way? Why was that covered up by the media, by the way? What's going on? Like, why is the media covering this up?
You know the reason. I mean, it's all part of
historical
this.
question.
Yes, it's all part of this. What we talked about in the very first episode is the parasitic mind virus of suicidal empathy, where the Western world has this guilt about them in terms of how we apparently treat, the Muslim world. I guess if you go back to the establishment of the State of Israel, if you go back to our response to the 9/11 attacks, I suppose that you can make that argument that, we've been harsh on the Muslim world, and for some reason we feel now that we have to commit suicide in order to make amends for that. And that's what it is.
Right. But like the thought that they're just harsh on the Muslim world, like the argument is that you're stealing, or we're just...
No, I'm not legitimizing their argument.
I'm not saying you are, but I'm just saying the comments that are made, like, Islamic fundamentalism is not a new problem.
No.
It's been an old problem. People talk about the Crusades, and the Crusades, they did their things too, but they're fighting back on a lot of that too. Right. Like this has been going on since the beginning of time, and now we're seeing it.
Well, since the beginning of
Islam, right.
600 BC.
Right. And it's spreading, and we can talk about that. We can talk about the population growth and the number of Muslims in the world compared to now, and it's not to say... And that's why the narrative is switched and everybody's shitting on Israel. It's not to say that all Muslims hate Jews, but I venture to say most of them are anti-Israel, right?
For sure.
So that's not a shocking thing. No. And when I see now the brainwash, like, let's talk about the college campuses.
Okay.
Who's the number one funder of all these upper league schools, or all these schools? Qatar.
Yes.
The numbers are out there. Do your research.
Yes.
Billions of dollars.
Right.
They're not stupid.
Right.
Qatar is the number one, with Iran, are the number one funders and pushers of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. It's not hard to see. That's why it's troubling to me when I see Trump over there doing with the... I'm hoping there's a bigger agenda there, is what I'm hoping, right? And accepting planes. I don't like that, right? I don't like any business with these people, right? Because I know what they stand for. Saudi Arabia doesn't speak to Qatar because they came out saying, look, they won't stop funding terrorism.
Right.
And they're not stupid. They're trying to spread the word by birth rates. They're trying to spread the word by birth rates. They're trying to spread the word by college campuses and manipulation. The education system has been manipulated in this country. The higher learning institutions, like, you hear the number in, I think Harvard is like 40% of them are from
foreign students.
Foreign students.
At least.
Something like that. And look, that's not to say that we don't want foreign students. But
well, and think about it too.
You're going to get that influence, is what I'm saying.
Yes, and that's another thing that I think that the majority of Americans don't really understand, and that is when you have all this money coming from Qatar, and you're a university like Harvard, and Qatar says we're going to give you $1 billion, but I want you to create a pro-Palestinian department. It's not just, hey, we're giving you this money and thank you very much. No, you're going to create a department. You're going to staff it with Islamists.
Right.
And you're going to create curriculum that's going to, be pro-Palestinian and manipulate your students. That's what the money does. So it needs to be understood that, a lot of what's driving what we see on college campuses are departments that were specifically created with Arab money to spread this Islamist ideology.
Right. So, we can't keep ignoring it, though. When you're seeing that, I literally, anyone in a certain age group, I have some in my family that are literally, my extended family, that are literally pushing pro-Palestine narratives, which is the most heartbreaking thing in the world to me. And have a conversation with me. Make these ridiculous comments, but they're being brainwashed.
Yes.
It's not, and it's a combination, and it's literally being taught what they want to teach, and trendiness too. I mean, these days it's trendy. It's just trendy to be pro-Palestine.
Right.
Like the pro-Israel people are not commenting on, they're not the ones that are on there commenting. You know, there's some pushback now by people, but that's not what they're doing. They stay quiet, right? The people that are seeing what this is are staying quiet, but you can't
too many
stay quiet much longer.
Right.
Look at what's happening. It's spilling into the streets when you're seeing cities overwhelmed and these marches. And what do you think is going to happen? There's going to be more of these incidents. Like, as Jewish people don't feel safe right now in this country, which is crazy to me. I've been American. I'm American. I've lived here all my life.
Right.
I've never had a point in time where I genuinely was, not trusting of the country.
Right.
That's where I am right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I do. I find myself in certain situations having an internal conversation. Should I hide my Star of David today? And, half of me says, what's wrong with you? Be proud and, don't succumb to the pressure. And the other half says, well, I'm going in to get some food. I don't want somebody spitting in my food because they see I'm wearing a Star of David. So, I have these internal conversations every single day. Sometimes I do. I go to the gym and I have a hostage, M Yisrael High band on my wrist here, which basically says that, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel live. This is what it says. Sometimes I'll turn it around because the gym is very crowded. I don't know who's in there. I don't know who's watching. And you see, based on what happened in New York, in DC last week, with those 2 kids that were killed, I don't know who's going to come up and hit me in the back of the head with a dumbbell. Maybe that's paranoid. Maybe maybe it's
I don't think
hyperbole, but I find myself doing that because I know I'm in an enclosed space, and I'm working out and there's people all around me. And I've never had to do that before in my life. I've never felt that way. But it is something that I do think about every single day now. It is a different mentality. And I don't know how many people feel like I do in that sense where, I saw something today that was very interesting. It said, like the Holocaust didn't happen, like in 1941. It started in 1933, right? So what happened during those 8 years between 1933 and 1941? This. Mm-hmm. That was the quote that I saw today. This is what happened with all what that we're seeing, the slow burn, right? So yeah, I mean, I find myself sometimes now sitting in, groups or crowds, watching a game or a concert, thinking to myself, I don't even know if I'm living in real life. I look around, I see everybody having a good time, and I think to myself, for all I know, I'm the Jew in the room, and if these people knew it, what would they think? So it's no longer just, living free in the United States and going about your life. Now you have to consider all of these things, because of this situation that's been allowed to fester by Western leaders and by Western legacy media.
Well, like I said in one of the prior episodes, I used to think, like, how did Hitler dupe an entire nation of Germany, like a respected, with a big history, very highly educated? And some nasty person put a comment like, oh, he wasn't duped. He saw the Jews for what they are.
All right, of course, we get that. Sure, everywhere, all the time. Jews are thrown out of everywhere all the time.
That becomes more acceptable to say. And you have this era of people that are way too confident in making statements because they're sure they're not going to get punched in the nose, where we came up in a time where you didn't make statements like,
right,
you didn't get away with that. You can say that to someone's face, fine, but you might get punched in the face. You will get punched in the face. These guys are little keyboard warrior rats. Right. They just make that statement. It's become acceptable to say. And then they're repeating it. And now you got this word Zionism you can hide behind now too. And that's what's going on. And the Qatar problem, we can sit here and ignore it. And you would think, and you see their influence everywhere. The media, they're controlling the media. People say the Jews control the media. I'm like, how is that? Right. The Jews are getting shit on in the media. I mean, look at Tucker Carlson. Yeah. Let's talk about this scumbag for a minute. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And people think, oh, he's conservative. That's the thing is people are tribal too. Like, oh, he's conservative. How,
Yeah.
He's a scumbag.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why, because he's bought and paid for, and he's a full anti-Semite.
Yeah.
And he,
sure.
you can see his Qatari connection. You could look it up.
Yeah.
He's funded by them.
Yep.
And even this Theo Von comedian, who I thought's hilarious, right? But all of a sudden he goes to Qatar. The next week he's shitting on Israel and saying it's genocide. You think that there's no correlation there?
There's a correlation.
Joe Rogan. All of a sudden, Joe Rogan, he's going to all these, all of a sudden he's pushing pro-Palestinian. You think like, and the biggest scumbag, I'm sorry, I'm putting it out there. Pierce Morgan. This is a guy I used to watch his stuff, right?
Yep.
And look, he's always been a hedge my bet kind of guy. He's like, well, he gives the narrative that he gives a little bit of the Israeli narrative, then he gives, and he stays in the middle and talks about how he's high educated. He's full of shit, right? We all know it. But he has good, for the most times, you get some big guests, so it's worth watching, but I don't think anymore. Now, he just goes for whoever's the higher rating, and I get it. Look.
Well, and isn't that the truth? It's popular.
Right.
And it sells.
And guess what?
So they're all on board.
He's completely flipped now, and he's saying it's genocide, right? He knows the definitions of this stuff.
Yes.
Guess where he's right now? He's in he's in an Arab country for 4 days. All of a sudden, his last 3 episodes have been literally shitting on Israel. Right. And let's not talk about the murders, right? No one's talking about the murders. These big platforms are not talking about the murders. They're talking about starvation in Gaza. Another fake narrative. This is all fake.
Right. Everything that they say is factually inaccurate. There's
the 14,000 babiys. Do you remember that headline?
Yes.
That's what got
that was the day before.
Killed.
Yes, exactly.
14,000 babies, they said, would starve
tomorrow in 48 hours.
If 48 hours if they don't get aid immediately.
Yeah. It was a lie.
Debunked immediately the next day by, of all people, like the BBC.
Right.
Saying, you know what, that's not what it was. It's an old article saying that 14,000 people could starve if they were, like,
over the next 56 months or some ridiculous
I don't
rationalization.
Corrections in the media. Nobody saw it, but now all of a sudden these narratives of like let's double down and shit on Israel. They're starving people, and let's murder an innocent couple that has,
It's terrible.
It's just,
and the irony was that couple, my understanding is that they were both very pro peace, that they weren't hawks. They were trying to bridge gaps between Israelis and Palestinians, much like the kids that were killed at the Nova Festival.
The agenda for what they were meeting for was how to get more aid into Gaza.
There you go. Right.
Do you think this Gonzalez kid cared about that?
No.
This is what I'm saying. Like, it's just, what is an American Latin kid here? What are you doing?
I mean, his background, from what I understand, has been this kind of manipulation where he's been involved in these pro-Palestinian groups, and this has been happening for a long time. But this is what's been going on: is this homegrown, manipulation of the masses, because we have an easy way to do it now. Anti-Semitism obviously is the spark, so it's easy, right, to go from there. And then when everybody gets on board. Right, the media, the institutions, Hollywood, the Democratic Party, it becomes acceptable, which is what you said earlier. So once it becomes acceptable, October 7th, they say, didn't turn people into anti-Semites. October 7th gave the anti-Semites the license to be open about their anti-Semitism.
Right. And I don't really see it getting better. I see it getting worse, unfortunately. So, and
it's hard to be optimistic.
So in the past, like when the conflicts have kind of settled down, that kind of rhetoric has settled down, but it never reached this pitch before. I've been through many Israeli conflicts with Hamas, with Hezbollah. I remember, and I always say, the narrative's going to switch because the world switches and this, but the fever pitch we're at right now, I've never seen.
Yeah, I mean I would say the detached, objective Lloyd would say, and my brothers would tell you that I would say that it seems like it is it seems like it's inevitable. In other words, you have so many people, right? So many Muslims, so many Arabs surrounding a very small Jewish state. And if the world is coming out against that Jewish state, I mean, really, how much longer can it last, right? How much longer? Is it sustainable? I just don't know. And I become very pessimistic that it makes any sense for Jews to even remain in the region. Fuck it, bring them to desert in California, you know.
I had somebody say that.
We've built it before, we can build it again, and they can leave them to their own devices. I mean, you know, they'll destroy beautiful Israel in 10 days like they always do, and then they'll kill each other, the Sunni and the Shia, right? And they won't be able to blame the Jews anymore. But you said something earlier that does give me hope, and that, you know, Donald Trump, who, you know, look, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I not a perfect candidate by any stretch of the imagination. Don't love everything that he does, but I think that for the region, yes, the answer to your earlier question, which is that you hope that something bigger is going on. And I feel like if he can bring about the Abraham Accords, right? If he can bring stability to the region, that only benefits Israel, right? So, you know, he can make deals with these, you know, these countries, regardless of their human rights records, so long as he establishes peace and prosperity within the region. You know, economy drives a lot of things, right? So, you know, if people everywhere are prospering and there's peace and there's security, I think that lends itself to, you know, less war in the Middle East. Right. So I think a byproduct of all of that would be a sustainable Israel.
Well, he's attacking the influence, because this comes from the influence.
Yes.
And the Arab countries have been pushing this narrative. They had an interest in the Palestinians remaining, quote, refugee.
For sure.
Because the Jews are in an area, and it stems from a religious belief. But economic beliefs will eventually overpass religious belief. We see that in capitalism, which is what's happening in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
They're prospering. UAE, Bahrain, like these countries are like, okay, well, I get this old religious thing we told people for.
Well, the prince, Saudi Arabia, what does he say?
Right.
He says, no, I don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia. I don't want Islamists in Saudi Arabia, because we have a great economy and we have a wonderfully functioning, you know, high functioning country, right? We're prosperous, and we don't have any war.
You flush that out.
And they need the money.
Right. When you flush that out and you stop this influence, all of a sudden you're going to see when the other Arab countries come out and say, hey, listen, and they're already, Qatar and those guys, like, we don't want Palestinians here.
Right.
They come in here and they cause shit. They're Islamists. We don't want that.
And it's possible. Look at the history shows it. I mean, we signed armistice deals with Egypt. It's held. We signed armistice deals with Jordan. It's held. Lebanon,
they built a more strong wall than we have.
Right.
They don't want.
Oh, the Egyptian border, of course.
Yeah.
I know better.
They know.
Yep.
Because it comes in and it starts shit. We don't want that anymore. Al-Sisi came out and gave one of the most historic speeches when he first took in.
Yep.
And you can say what you want about him. He has, I'm sure, his flaws too, but he's not an Islamist.
Right.
And he said, he lectured the clerics, like, enough. Stop teaching our kids this stuff.
Yes.
Stop it. And these countries that are still doing it are influencing. Qatar is one of the last of the Mohicans.
Yeah.
Like the Iranians too, but the Qataris are they're the most because at least Iran's not hiding it. They're out there saying it. Qatar,
they play both sides.
That's right. Why is Qatar negotiating? Why do they have Hamas there? Right. Why are they there? Why were they there in their nice hotels and resorts? And why are we all the time? Nobody's questioning that.
Right.
You think the U.S. government's stupid? No. They know this. So attack the influence.
Yep.
Let's do trillions of dollars of deals with these guys. But they're so focused on their money making, they give up this childish, endless, brutal push.
See another way. In other words, see another way through it instead of, the same old conflict. You know, the Jews want to live in peace and the Arabs want them dead. Let's dispense with that and see if we can't figure out a way, you know, that everybody can live together and prosper and stop with the killing. And, you know, to me, you know, if you stop the intifadas, you dispense with your, you know, homicidal ideology, your Jew hate, there can be peace and there can be prosperity and they can coexist. And the walls and the checkpoints all come down at that point.
Well, the thought is that economics are going to bring us out of this. And it's a correct thought. But the problem is we're pumping all this money into the Gaza, into the wrong people's hands who kept all of it.
Yeah.
And have an interest in still pushing this narrative, and they have the backing of these countries like Qatar and Iran, So they stole all the money, and the money was a good thought, right? Like, if we pump money, they develop, people get jobs, people have careers, people have a future, people stop with this old religious bullshit, right? But it was never going to those people. And not only that, they were doubling down on the education and making them believe the Jews are doing all this to you and all this kind of stuff. So it backfired. So people to say no occupation. The only way that this is going to fix is if some other foreign entity, maybe not the Israelis, but someone with this like-minded approach is controlling the money. And if they're controlling the money, like...
You see even with the aid now, like where the Trump administration has basically said, okay, you know, despite what the public wants to believe, the aid is coming, but Hamas is stealing it. And then they're charging the population exorbitant prices to get the aid that is supposed to be given to them by the United Nations. So what's going on, right? Well, we know that the United Nations is going to pressure Israel to continue to deliver aid to the Palestinians, and Hamas is going to continue to intercept it. And the war is never going to end because they're well supplied by the world. So what does the Trump administration do? They say, okay, we're going to send American contractors in there that are going to be responsible for distributing the aid, and we're going to cut Hamas out. And that's what's going on right now as we speak. The Americans are bringing in aid. The Americans are delivering the aid, and they're cutting Hamas out. And yesterday, the population in Gaza rose up.
I saw that.
Okay, and despite Hamas checkpoints, all right, and roadblocks trying to keep the population from getting to the aid, Hamas did this yesterday, right? The people said enough is enough, and they broke through those blockades, and sure enough, they were able to get, you know, their aid. 450,000 meals were dispersed in a couple of days. Right. So it can be done if you have the will, right? If you have the will to go in there, and this is what I believe should have happened on October 8th. Had people really care about Palestinian people, if people really care about Gazan babies, right, then the world would have stood up on October 8th, right? All the world leaders would have got up on TV together and said, hey, Hamas, what the fuck? You got 24 hours to release those hostages and lay down your weapons and be done. And then the world would continue to pressure Hamas to do this day after day after day. That's not what happened. The world pressured Israel, right, to surrender to the terrorists that invaded them, killed,
keep the loop going.
People. Why? Does that make any sense? If you really care about the people, okay, then you're going to make Hamas leave so that the people can create their own country, which is what the Israelis had hoped they would have done when Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005 and gave it to them and said, here, you got it. You're all set. You have your, you have your agriculture. You have your greenhouses. You have your infrastructure. As a matter of fact, we're going to take all of our Jews out of Gaza, including our dead, and we're going to give it to you. Here, make it, make it the light of the Middle East, right? And instead, they took all that money, trillions of dollars over 20 years, and built tunnels, right? And a war infrastructure so that they could attack Israel on October 7th. That's what they did,
right? But the big thing is to call the spade a spade.
Yes.
So when there's a narrative, when you're saying Palestinian doctors have been kidnapped, no, it was just doctors. Doctors are being kidnapped.
Right.
Okay. How can we fix this issue if you're not even willing to admit that these guys, half of them are Hamas, they're calling themselves doctors. You don't know that they're doctors, or if they are, you can't prove any of this. These are just statements.
No, and nine times out of 10, a couple of weeks later, they recant. It happens every single time. Oh, that doctor happened to be a Hamas terrorist. Or that reporter's, here he is in a photograph with his AK-47 and his keffiyeh wrapped around his head.
What benefit does it do Israeli military to kill a doctor? For what? What's the strategic goal there?
Right. They know that it's going to draw outrage from the world. Why would they do that on purpose?
Yeah. They're not.
They're not. And then that's the problem. And it's the same news organizations that admit they made a mistake, like the BBC. Oh, yeah, we manipulated that whole documentary. And, the victims were actually Hamas, right? And so that whole thing was completely manipulated. It was all propaganda. We're sorry. And then 2 weeks later, they do it again. So it's like, there's no accountability.
Al Jazeera, before they were American speaking, just so you know, I lived in Israel for a few years. I traveled the world a lot.
Yep.
They were literally known to be not a serious news outlet. They were Islamic propagandists. That's what they did.
Yeah.
The articles they put out were just a joke.
Yeah.
They got funding. Qatar now made them an English-speaking network, and people cite them like they're like literally a legitimate news.
And they tell two different stories, by the way. In their English version, they tell one whitewashed, version for Western audiences, and then in their Arabic newspapers and their online platform, it's all Jew hate.
But imagine how stupid they think us Americans are.
We are.
But isn't that should be insulting? That we know that they can put out anything they want to say in English that sounds good and fits the narrative that they're pushing. They know you're not going to do the research it's on public television. You can find it. These people are saying the craziest things.
Doesn't that bring us back to the school thing, the college campus thing?
Of course.
Because, and the Trump administration's approach, taking away money and canceling contracts. And of course, the left is all up in arms. Oh my God, how dare you attack freedom of speech? How dare you try to prevent, those kids from killing Jews, or advocating for the killing of Jews.
Right.
But it brings us back to a justification for what Trump is doing, and that is national security, because what we're describing, what we've been talking about this whole time, is an overall effort from all sides to change the world order. So when President Trump says, I'm doing this for national security reasons, it's not hyperbole. Because if this is allowed to continue, like you said, our masses are so ignorant, our education is so bad in the United States when it comes to history and geography and world events, that we're easily manipulated. And if our entire society can be manipulated this way, of course, it's going to change the nature of our country. So I don't disagree with President Trump when he says it's a national security issue.
It's a major national security issue. Look what's going on. I mean, literally, to go to synagogue, at a well-known synagogue, and I'm not even religious. I'm not particularly religious, but, there's functions you go to, and part of that, and you should see the searches we have to go through. And I mean, Jews are literally, I hate to freak people, you're not safe.
No.
You have lunatics. These people are spatting. The young kids are just so ridiculous.
Yeah, we have to go through metal detectors to get into the synagogue. Who else has to?
What other
Muslims,
religious institutions?
The Christians, when
cars routinely parked outside.
Exactly.
The one rabbi in downtown, he has a cop car he rents.
Yeah, just to have it sit there. Deterrence.
Now that I think about it, almost all of them have that. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That's
for sure.
That says something, and that should scare everybody. We're talking about, a protected group and the poor Palestinians. And look, you got the Jews are the most oppressed people in the history of time, and they're telling you right now. And they've always been the canary in the coal mine, right? They've always the warning of a society having major problems is the Jews go first, right?
Right.
They get attacked first. That's why time.
That's why the whole, it's so mind-boggling that the Jews are attacked by the left, because the Jews are the ultimate, progressive story. They're forever oppressed, and they can't deny it, right? Because they'll turn around and go, well, it's your fault. Of course you're oppressed. So they agree that we're oppressed. Whatever their rationale is, obviously they agree, right? Okay. Well, you've been kicked out of every country all over the world because you're Jews. It must be your fault. So they acknowledge that we're oppressed, right? So we're a very small minority, always subject to the whims of the countries or the government or the state that we're in, and to the whelms of the population, right? And then what do? We go back to our indigenous homeland and, establish self-determination. You would think that would be, a wonderful story for those on the left. But because it's Jews, it's the other way around. We're the one, we're not allowed to have that same self-determination. We're not allowed to immigrate anywhere, right? Where else in the world do people emigrate and they're either killed or ostracized for it? Only the Jews.
For the focus of the world, there are literally two countries. There's potential for a nuclear encounter between the U.S. and Russia. Not to scare people. North Korea. This is the biggest story.
Iran.
This is the biggest story. I wonder why it's the biggest story. Why it's always the biggest story throughout the history of time.
Right. Yep.
So, I mean, listen, we're gonna keep talking about this issue as it goes, and there'll be updates, and I'm sure, and hopefully, the violence will subside.
Yeah, it would be nice if we didn't have to have these podcasts anymore.
Right, and we'll get to a point, but right now, the media has gone wild. All these, other podcasters have literally just, I've literally sold their souls. This is not, nothing's changed. There's been no difference here. You just have to say that.
Talking, but you have to keep trying to educate.
We're going to keep educating and talking, and you're welcome to comment, and we'll respond to your comments.
And solutions, look, your wife.
Yeah, give us
solutions. Give us solutions. Well, tell, again, be honest and, intellectually honest and say, okay, what would your solution be? And don't say, well, the 8 million Jews should just pick up and leave.
That's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. So let's talk practicality.
How do we fix this?
Yeah.
Right? How do you fix this? Not just you dogs, that's not going to do anything.
That's right. Killing each other,
going anywhere,
not going to work.
And Israel's sole focus is protecting themselves,
right?
And they're going to keep doing that for good reason. And if anything, all this is just making the case for Israel. So, thanks for coming on, Lloyd.
Welcome.
And I'll have you back.
Happy to
be all my viewers. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to Two Taps and Friends. We love you. Do me a favor, like and subscribe to the channel. I'm being told I have to say that to you every time. We're on YouTube, YouTube Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify. I know I'm forgetting something, but we're everywhere. Also, we now have a link for Two Taps and Friend merchandise. If you want to purchase that, you can walk around with your swag. So thank you all for listening. We love you all, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Cut.